Hi, this is Mike. I'm an adventuring dad. And modifying your truck or SUV to go overlanding or off-roading does not have to be complicated. But if you surf enough forums, watch enough YouTube videos, read enough Reddit posts, and really believe in yourself, you can make it complicated. In this video, we're going to talk about bump stops for off-road vehicles. And if you want to keep it simple, here's all you really need to know. 1, you definitely need bump stops. 2, bump stops are just a piece of rubber that goes between the frame of your vehicle and the moving suspension components so that when they bottom out, you don't have harsh metal-to-metal contact that would cause damage and be uncomfortable. 3, your vehicle already comes with them from the factory. Lastly, unless you're getting really extreme or you just like making things really complicated, you don't need to change your bump stops at all. What you have from the factory will likely work just fine. If you do decide you want to move forward and make things really complicated, here's what you need to know for that. Our Tacoma has Old Man Emu's BP51 suspension, including shocks and springs, so it sits about 2.5 inches over the factory ride height. So many lift kits will come with a spacer that goes between the bump stop and the frame to lower it down a little bit or raise it up depending on the configuration. And that's because the shocks that you might get for your new suspension will not compress as far. So the fully compressed will be longer than the factory. So you need to increase the distance the bump stop is from the frame so that you don't smash the end of those shocks and bottom the shocks out, which would be bad. The Old Man Emu kit does not. The instructions do not require or recommend modifying the bump stops. The specifications state that it is compatible with zero lift and the collapse length of the shock is only about 1 inch greater than the stock shock. If I wanted to keep things simple, and we've already established that I don't, then I would just put the factory bump stops back on and move on down the road. The factory bump stops look like this. However, when I installed the Timbren kit, I got the U-bolt flip kit that goes with that, and that converts the U-bolts from pointing down like this to pointing up. And the goal with that is to get just a little bit more clearance between the axle and the ground. Whether that's necessary or not, I don't know, but it certainly is more complicated. However, the rear axle in the Tacoma does not have a lot of up travel. That means that you end up using the bump stops a lot. I installed Timbren rubber bump stops a few years ago to help with that, and you can check out the video where I talk about that install. The short story there is that even though Timbren markets these bump stops as softer than stock, they aren't really. When the truck hits them, it's jarring and bouncy, and I don't love it. Ultimately, I do need something softer than the Timbren bump stops. A few months ago, Super Springs came across my video and asked if I wanted to try out their Sumo Springs product. Sumo Springs are a bump stop made of microcellular polyurethane foam. They come in 3 different densities depending on the weight of your vehicle. Some Sumo Springs can be used for carrying a constant load, like an overload spring. But for my purposes, it's just a bump stop. So let's do a comparison of all of the bump stops that we have here today. The stock bump stop is short and made of very hard rubber because it's meant as a last resort padding in case of big impacts. It's about 61 millimeters of rubber. And you know, when the spring compresses, this comes into contact with the pad and it smushes down a little bit. This is 62 millimeters above the spring. So this distance here is 62 millimeters. This metal plate is just about 1 millimeter, and the rest, about 61 millimeters, is rubber. So I did a compression test on all these bump stops, and I put them on the jack, and I basically jacked up the front of my dad's white Chevy Silverado. I used the Silverado because it's a little bit heavier in the front than the Tacoma, so I figured it would be a little bit easier to see the compression on these. Don't have a hydraulic press, unfortunately. What I found was that basically the only part of this that compresses is right here at the tip top. This last little pyramid is all that compresses, and it only compresses about 18 millimeters, so 1.8 centimeters, well less than 1 inch of compression. About 29% of the total volume is all that compresses for this. However, the one advantage to this is this overall distance. So as the spring goes up, the spring will travel farther before it compresses, which gives your suspension, your shocks, more opportunity to compress and top out, and the shocks that we have on this truck will actually ramp up quite a bit and control the harsh top outs really well on their own. Now, is it enough to work with these bump stops? I don't know. I don't really have the configuration to test that on the setup as it sits today, so I don't know. The Timbren bump stop is made of a similar black rubber, but it's hollow inside and has a bellowed structure to allow it to be softer than solid rubber would be. It's much taller at 95 millimeters and is designed to impact earlier in the travel to spread the harsh stop out over a greater distance. Aside from being much, much bigger, it's much heavier. This has got to be over a pound. It's very, very heavy. It's got this big, thick plate of steel and then the rubber bump stop up there. Now, the total distance from the top of the bump stop to the spring on this one is 130 millimeters. 13 centimeters from the spring sits right here to where it contacts. The rubber is only about 95 millimeters. Now, this has two bellows here, and as you can see, it's hollow on the inside. And so it's not just a solid piece of rubber, so it's designed to compress quite a bit. And it does compress quite a bit. It compresses 41%, about 56 millimeters of total compression under the semi-quantitative test that I did with the Silverado. Not only does it move the contact point farther up, it limits the up travel quite a bit. So when it's fully compressed, it's 91 millimeters from the spring to the top of it when it's fully compressed, which is even higher than this is before it compresses at all. So it definitely limits up travel on a suspension that doesn't need the up travel limited, because as I've determined, the ARB BP51 springs don't require that you move your bump stop at all. So this ends up feeling fairly harsh at ride height. The way I have the Tacoma right now, I only have a couple inches, less than 2 inches of clearance of up travel before it makes contact. I make contact with it every time we back out of our driveway, every time we hit a speed bump, and every time we hit a bump going down dirt roads. So we feel it all the time, and it's, to be honest, I think kind of a big deal. This is the Sumo Spring. The Sumo Spring is taller still at 139 millimeters and is made of a completely different material called the microcellular polyurethane. It's designed with less bounce to soften harsh rebounds, which is the exact thing I was looking for. This one is very nearly as heavy as this, probably a little bit lighter because I think that this material is lighter. They call this a microcellular polyurethane. It is squishy like a foam, but still very dense. The blue is actually the least dense that you can get from Sumo. The distance that this sits, it's 130 millimeters above the spring, so it's almost a full centimeter taller off the spring, comes into contact with the vehicle a full centimeter sooner. It is 103 millimeters of foam. So it's almost a full centimeter more of foam. When it's fully compressed, it is 81 millimeters from the spring to the top. So the total up travel is about a centimeter more with this than it is with this. And now that's a good thing because you want more travel from your suspension just in general. So the total compression for this is about 56%. So if you're talking about total compression, you've got the worst here at 29%, the best here at 56%. So the result is that this bump stop will slow the bump down over a longer distance, which means it's gonna be softer. By definition, it's gonna be softer. So I've actually been driving around with the Sumo Springs, the rear and also the front. I'll talk about this more later on the driver's side of the vehicle. And it's a subtle difference, I'd have to say, but I can definitely tell that this is softer when I hit bumps, when I come out of our harsh driveway, when we hit speed bumps. And then there's, at the Maverick gas station where we fill up, there's the ports where they fill the tanks, which are raised up. And so you can drive across those preferentially on one side or the other and feel the difference as it cycles through those. And you can see in the video that it's making contact and it's soft and it's squishy. You can't tell from the video, but it is noticeably softer with the Sumo Spring versus the Timbren spring. Again, I can't compare it with the stock spring. My guess is that with the stock spring, it wouldn't even make contact at all because the internal bypass shocks would soak up all the bumps and I wouldn't notice it at all. So if there's a way for me to go back to this, I probably would just go back to this. But I think I threw away the plates and the U-bolts that I need to use this. So I'd have to buy some new ones, which I'm not gonna do. As for the front Sumo Springs, so if you look at the front bump stop, it is just a piece of rubber on a little post and it threads into the frame. And the new one replaces that with quite a bit more foam. So there's a lot more foam and it's softer. So I did a test and this bump stop never really got used. With the current suspension that we have on it, it never really made contact with this at all. The shocks would control the movement just fine on their own. They didn't need help. With this on there, it has just a little bit of clearance to the A-arm when it's at normal ride height. And it does make contact as we're going over bumps, but to be honest, I really can't feel it. So whether these are needed or not, I cannot say. They feel good, and if you think that you need a little bit of extra support, like you're carrying a bunch of extra weight on the front of your vehicle and you want a little bit of bottom out control, these are probably a great option for that. When it comes right down to it, neither the Timbren active off-road bump stops nor the Sumo Springs are actually bump stops. They're overload springs. Sumo Springs lean into this with their description and calls them a suspension enhancement. Timbren has two products, and you can see the debate about them in the comments on my original video. The active off-road bump stop, which is what I have, and the suspension enhancement system, which is explicitly an overload spring. The description calls the SES springs and describes the attributes of a spring, the same as the Sumo Springs page. The thing is, the active off-road bump stops are pretty similar, except for the overall kit height and the load rating, with the active off-road bump stops being a half an inch shorter and 4,000 pounds lighter. I can't imagine a Tacoma with 6,000 pounds on the axle. Either way, the Timbren active off-road bump stop is more of an overload spring than it is a bump stop. And at that point, I think the Sumo Springs is a better design. Though neither product will go to full compression when rock crawling or slowly flexing out the suspension, which means that they both limit suspension travel. If you need the extra load carrying capacity, then that may be a trade-off that you're willing to make. So that's all I have to say about that. If you want to make things even more complicated and follow me down this path of overthinking something that, to be quite honest, you really don't need to think about at all, the best way to do that would be to leave a comment down below and tell me how I'm wrong or right or way off base or brilliant, whatever comes to mind. Thanks for watching and happy trails.
Holy moly!